The story you're about to hear I found on Reddit. It gives me goosebumps. But did it really happen? So, let's get started. I've been working as a night shift security guard at Walmart for about 6 months. It's not exactly thrilling work. Mostly, I just sit in the security booth, monitor the cameras, and occasionally walk the perimeter. Nights are quiet around here, especially in this town. The parking lot is usually empty by 11 p.m., and the rest of my shift is spent keeping an eye out for loiterers or kids trying to sneak in for late-night pranks. Nothing out of the ordinary ever happens. Until last night. It started like any other shift. I clocked in at 10 p.m., grabbed a coffee from the break room, and settled into the booth with the monitors. The grainy screens showed the usual, empty aisles inside the store, a couple of stray shopping carts in the lot, and a stray cat darting around near the dumpsters. The hours dragged by, and by 2 a.m., I was fighting to keep my eyes open. That's when I saw them. At first, I thought my tired brain was playing tricks on me. Out in the farthest corner of the parking lot, barely illuminated by the flickering overhead lights, stood 2 figures. One was tall, unnaturally tall, its silhouette sharp and angular. The other was much smaller, a little girl no older than 8 or 9. She was holding the taller figure's hand. I blinked a few times, rubbed my eyes, and leaned closer to the monitor. The figures were still there, motionless. The little girl was dressed in a light-colored dress, the kind you might wear to a church or family gathering. Her hair was long and dark, falling past her shoulders. The taller figure, though, that one sent a chill down my spine. It was hard to make out any details, but the way it stood, perfectly still and rigid, reminded me of a mannequin. Its arms were too long, its shoulders too narrow. It wasn't shaped like any person I'd ever seen. My first thought was that this had to be a prank. Maybe some kids had propped up a dummy and dressed it to look creepy. But the girl, she looked too real to be part of a joke. I reached for the radio. This is Jim. Got a couple of people loitering in the parking lot, far west corner. Could you send someone out to check it? Static crackled back at me, followed by the familiar voice of Chris, the shift manager. No one's here but you, Jim. Store's been closed for hours. Yeah, I know, I replied, my voice wavering. But there's a girl and someone else out there. Maybe it's a lost kid or something. You sure no one's around? I'm sure, Chris said, his tone flat. If you're seeing something, it's probably kids messing around. Go take a look. I sighed, reluctantly grabbed my flashlight, and stepped out of the booth. The cold night air hit me immediately, and I pulled my jacket tighter as I started walking toward the west corner of the lot. Each step felt heavier than the last. As I got closer, I noticed something odd. The girl wasn't moving. Neither was the tall figure. They just stood there like statues. The parking lot was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Hey, I called out, my voice echoing in the empty lot. Is everything okay? Do you need help? No response. I stopped about 20 feet away, shining my flashlight on them. The girl's face was pale, her expression blank. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unblinking. The taller figure was harder to make out. It was dressed in something dark, and its face seemed wrong. The features were smudged, almost like they'd been erased. Sir? Miss? I tried again, my voice shaking now. You're not supposed to be here. If you need assistance, I can call someone. The flashlight flickered. It was only for a second, but when the beam steadied again, the figures were closer. They hadn't moved. At least I hadn't seen them move, but they were now standing just 10 feet away. My heart started pounding in my chest. I took a step back. That's when the little girl turned her head, her gaze locking onto mine. Her lips parted, and she whispered something. I couldn't hear it, but I didn't have to. She wasn't asking for help. She was warning me. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The girl's lips moved again, forming words too soft to reach my ears. Her eyes were wide, glassy, and filled with something I couldn't place. Fear? Sadness? No, it was something worse, something primal. The taller figure didn't move, didn't even flinch. It just loomed behind her, its unnatural height casting a warped shadow across the asphalt. The light above flickered again, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw its face or lack of one. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just smooth, featureless skin where a face should be. My instinct screamed at me to turn around and bolt back to the booth, but I couldn't leave her there. I took a shaky step forward. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice cracking. "Do you need help?" The girl blinked once, slowly, her head tilted to the side, as if she were trying to understand me. Then she spoke again, her voice carrying on the cold night air this time. "Don't look at it." Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. "What?" I stammered, taking another step back. "What are you talking about? What is that?" She didn't answer. Her head snapped forward, eyes locked on the ground as if she were terrified of even glancing at the figure next to her. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. Her hand wasn't holding the figures. It was gripping her wrist. Tightly. Too tightly. The flashlight flickered again, and this time, when the beam steadied, she was gone. The tall figure remained. My breath caught in my throat, and a wave of nausea hit me. She had been standing right there, and now she was nowhere to be seen. My flashlight darted left and right, scanning the empty lot. Nothing. No sign of her. Just that thing standing there like it had been carved out of the night itself. I couldn't move. My legs felt rooted to the ground. My body locked in place as if the thing had reached out and paralyzed me without even touching me. Its head tilted slightly, the smooth, featureless surface angling toward me like it was studying me. I swallowed hard, willing myself to step back. Then it started to move. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette controlled by a clumsy puppeteer. The sound of its footsteps was all wrong, too. Not the steady thud of shoes on pavement, but a wet, sticky noise, like something dragging across the ground. It didn't walk straight toward me, either. It zigzagged, closing the gap between us in an erratic, unsettling pattern. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. My boots pounded against the asphalt as I sprinted back toward the booth. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. Every instinct I had screamed at me not to. "Don't look at it," the girl had said. That phrase looped in my mind, over and over, fueling my panic. The booth was only a few yards away when I heard it. A soft, wet whisper behind me. "Jim!" I nearly stumbled at the sound of my name. My legs screamed in protest as I pushed myself harder, practically diving into the booth and slamming the door shut behind me. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, fumbling to lock the door and draw the blinds. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely manage it. The whisper came again, closer this time. "Jim!" It wasn't just saying my name. It was mimicking my voice. I grabbed the phone on the desk and punched in Chris's extension. The line rang once, twice, and then went dead. Static filled the earpiece, and a faint, garbled voice cut through it. A voice that sounded eerily like the little girl's. "Don't look!" I slammed the phone down and backed away from the desk, my eyes darting to the monitors. The cameras flickered with static, but I could still make out parts of the parking lot. The tall figure was there, standing just outside the booth now. His head tilted, almost as if it were listening. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't alone anymore. Behind it, scattered across the parking lot, were more figures. Dozens of them. All tall, all faceless. All standing perfectly still in the dim light. And at the center of them all was the little girl. She looked directly into the nearest camera, her wide, empty eyes boring into mine through the screen. Her lips moved again, forming those same haunting words. "Don't look at it." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the monitor. The figures in the parking lot stood motionless, their bodies dark silhouettes against the dim, flickering lights. The little girl was still at the center, her lips moving soundlessly as she stared into the camera. "Don't look at it." The words echoed in my head, making my skin crawl. I wanted to turn the monitors off, to stop watching, but I couldn't risk losing track of them. The tall figures didn't move at first, but then one closest to the booth shifted. Took a step forward, just one, but it was enough to send a jolt of panic through me. Its head tilted again, the smooth surface catching a faint glint of light. I swallowed hard and backed away from the screen, bumping into the wall of the booth. The radio on the desk crackled to life. "Jim." The voice was faint, distorted, but I recognized it. "Chris." Relief surged through me, and I grabbed the radio like it was a lifeline. "Chris, thank God. Listen, there's someone out here in the parking lot. I don't know what's going on, but I need help. Call the cops now." Static hissed in response, followed by a low, garbled sound that made my stomach churn. "GM." It wasn't Chris anymore. The voice on the radio had shifted, deepened. It dragged out my name in a slow, wet drawl, almost like it was tasting the syllables. My grip on the radio tightened, my knuckles turning white. "Who the hell is this?" I shouted, my voice shaking. The reply came quickly, sharper this time. "Look outside." I dropped the radio like it had burned me, my heart hammering in my chest. My eyes darted to the monitors again. The figures were closer now, their jerky, unnatural movements bringing them just a few yards from the booth. The little girl hadn't moved from her spot in the center, but her head turned slightly, almost as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. "Don't look at it," I whispered to myself, backing further into the booth. My hands fumbled for the phone again, desperate to call anyone who could help, but the line was dead. The fluorescent light above me flickered, buzzing loudly. The sound grated against my nerves, making it hard to think. Then the first knock came, a soft, deliberate tap against the booth's door. I froze. The knock came again, louder this time. My breath hitched as I turned toward the door. The blinds were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just on the other side. Its shape was distorted, too tall and too thin to be a person. The doorknob rattled. "Jim." The voice was outside now, clear and unmistakable. It was my voice. "Let me in, Jim." The blinds trembled slightly, as if something was brushing against them. My whole body screamed at me to keep the door locked, to keep the blinds closed, to keep my eyes anywhere but there. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw the little girl on the monitor. She was staring right at me. Her mouth moved again, forming those same words. "Don't look at it." The knocking stopped. For a brief, fleeting moment I thought maybe it had left, whatever it was. But the silence that followed wasn't comforting. It pressed down on me, thick and suffocating, making the small booth feel even smaller. I forced myself to look back at the monitors. The figures were gone. The parking lot was empty again, save for the little girl. She stood alone now, her frail figure dwarfed by the emptiness around her. But the thing that had been knocking, it wasn't outside the door anymore. I glanced at the reflection in the darkened window behind the monitors, my stomach twisting into knots. There it was, inside the booth. The figure stood in the corner, impossibly tall and angular, its head nearly brushing the ceiling. Its featureless face was turned toward me, but it didn't move. It just stood there, as still as a shadow. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The booth was small. I should have felt it behind me, heard it, anything. But there had been nothing. No sound, no shift in the air. Just me and then it. "Don't look," I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. I kept my eyes on the monitors, refusing to turn around. My grip on the flashlight tightened, and I realized my hands were slick with sweat. It moved. I saw it in the reflection, a single, deliberate step forward. The sound it made was soft but wrong, like wet fabric dragging across the floor. My chest tightened as I fought the instinct to turn around, to confront it. "Jim." It said my name again, using that same mimicry, that same twisted version of my voice. Couldn't hold back anymore. I whipped around, flashlight beam cutting through the dimly lit booth. But there was nothing there. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as I scanned the small space, the flashlight's beam bouncing off the walls. It was empty. I turned back to the monitors, but the reflection in the window stopped me cold. It was still there, standing behind me. "Let me in, Jim," it said, its voice dripping with something vile, something hungry. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and stumbling out into the parking lot. The cold night air hit me like a slap to the face, but I didn't care. I ran, not stopping to look back, not caring where I was going. I just needed to get away. But no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape the sound. That wet, dragging noise. It was following me. My legs felt like they were on fire, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The cold air burned my lungs as I sprinted past the far end of the lot and onto the empty side street. My flashlight beam jittered wildly with each step, catching fleeting glimpses of bushes, fences, and street signs. The dragging sound was still behind me, slow and deliberate. I didn't dare look back. My pulse pounded in my ears, and my thoughts raced. Where could I go? The houses near the store were dark, their windows like empty eyes staring out into the night. The nearest open business was miles away. But then I spotted the gas station. It was small and dimly lit, its neon sign flickering over the pumps. The front window glowed faintly, and I could just make out the silhouette of someone inside. A cashier, maybe. My heart surged with hope. I forced myself to run faster, my boots slapping against the pavement as I closed the distance. The dragging sound grew louder. It was gaining on me. "Help!" I screamed, waving the flashlight as I approached the station. "Please, let me in." The cashier didn't move. I reached the door and yanked it open, the bell above it jingling loudly. The warmth of the gas station hit me like a wall, and for a split second, I felt safe. But then I noticed the cashier. He was standing behind the counter, staring straight ahead. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. His mouth hung open slightly, like he was mid-sentence but had forgotten the words. "Hey!" I shouted, slamming my hand on the counter. "You need to call the cops. There's something out there." He didn't react. I waved my hand in front of his face, but he didn't even blink. His chest rose and fell steadily, so I knew he was alive, but it was like he wasn't there. And then I noticed the glass doors behind me. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. But something was wrong. It wasn't moving. I turned my head slightly, and my reflection didn't follow. It just stared straight ahead, unblinking, like the cashier. My blood ran cold, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a rack of chips. The dragging sound was closer now. The bell above the door jingled again. The bell's chime cut through the thick, oppressive silence. My body locked up, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I couldn't move. I turned slowly toward the door, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. The gas station was empty. The door swung gently on its hinges, as if it had been opened by a breeze, but the night outside was completely still. The streetlights cast long, flickering shadows across the cracked pavement. I turned back to the cashier. He still hadn't moved, hadn't even acknowledged my presence. His blank, lifeless stare was starting to feel worse than whatever was out there. "Please," I said, my voice trembling. "Can you hear me? I need help. There's someone out there. We need to call the cops." Nothing. I leaned closer, desperate now, my hand gripping the edge of the counter for support. That's when I saw it. His pupils were dilated, swallowing the color of his eyes, and there was something faint, barely noticeable, reflected in them. A shape, a tall, featureless figure. My stomach dropped, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight slipped from my hand, clattering onto the tile floor. The sound echoed sharply in the stillness, and for a second, I thought it might snap him out of it. But he didn't move. Instead, the lights above us began to flicker. One by one, the overhead fluorescents blinked out, plunging the gas station into patches of shadow. The only steady light came from the flickering neon sign outside, casting an eerie glow through the windows. And then I heard it again. The dragging sound. It was inside. My breath hitched as I scanned the room, the weak light barely illuminating the rows of shelves. The sound grew louder, closer, each wet scrape cutting through the silence like a blade. "Don't look," I whispered to myself, clutching the counter for support. The girl's words echoed in my mind, louder and louder, until they drowned out everything else. "Don't look, don't look, don't." The dragging stopped. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating. My skin prickled with the sensation of being watched, and every instinct I had screamed at me to run. But my feet stayed rooted to the spot. I could feel it behind me. It was close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off it, close enough that I could hear the faint, wet sounds of its breath. "Jim," it whispered, low and guttural. The voice wasn't mine this time. It wasn't the girl's, either. It was something else entirely. I squeezed my eyes shut, refusing to turn around. "Go away," I choked out, my voice barely above a whisper. Silence. For one horrible moment, I thought it was gone. But then I felt it. A hand, cold and impossibly long, brushed against my shoulder. The cold hand lingered on my shoulder for a moment that felt like an eternity. It wasn't just cold, it was wrong. The touch sent a shiver through my body, like my skin was rejecting it, my very nerves recoiling from the contact. I bit down on a scream, my whole body trembling. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to fight, to do something. But I couldn't move. Then, slowly, the hand tightened its grip. "Jim," the voice said again, closer now, almost gentle. It dragged my name out like it enjoyed the sound. I shut my eyes tighter, my lips moving in silent prayer, though I didn't even know who I was praying to. The lights above flickered again, and in the brief bursts of illumination, I caught glimpses of the room through my eyelids. The cashier was gone. The counter was empty. Even with my eyes shut, I could feel the darkness closing in. "Don't look," I whispered again, my voice shaking. The thing behind me laughed. It was low and guttural, barely more than a rumble, but it wasn't natural. It was a sound that didn't belong in this world, something that made my stomach twist and my chest tighten. "Why not?" it whispered. The question hit me like a blow. Why not? Why shouldn't I look? Would it end this nightmare? Or would it make things worse? Its grip tightened further, cold fingers pressing into my shoulder. The pressure wasn't painful, but it was paralyzing, like it was anchoring me in place. "Look," it said again, more insistent this time. I shook my head violently, clenching my fists. No, I won't. You can't make me." The laughter came again, louder this time, echoing in the small, dark room. "Jim," it crooned, mocking. "You've already seen me." I froze. The words sliced through me, cutting deeper than the fear. Was it right? Had I already looked at it? On the monitors, in the parking lot, the reflection? My mind raced, replaying every moment, every glance, every flicker of movement. Its grip loosened slightly, as if it was giving me a choice. I opened my eyes. The room was dark, the neon light outside casting faint streaks across the tile. I didn't dare turn around, but I could see its shadow stretching across the floor. Long, distorted, with those impossibly spindly limbs and that smooth, featureless head. And then I realized something. The shadow wasn't coming from me. It was standing in front of me now. I gasped, stumbling back, my head snapping upward to look, and the lights went out completely. The world around me plunged into blackness, as if someone had sucked the air and light right out of the room. My breathing was loud and ragged, echoing in my ears as I stumbled backward. The only sound beyond my own panic was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like nails on glass. I fumbled for the flashlight on the floor, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. When I finally managed to grab it, I clicked it on, the beam cutting through the darkness in jittery, frantic arcs. The light revealed the gas station's aisles. Empty shelves, toppled snacks, and spilled drinks. But there was no sign of the thing, or the cashier. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the front window. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, its beam illuminating the glass door. My stomach lurched. The little girl was standing there, her pale face pressed against the glass, her small hand tapping rhythmically. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and fixed on me. Her other hand pointed at something to my left. I froze, my whole body going cold. She was pointing behind me. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." The air behind me grew heavy, pressing against my back like a physical weight. I could feel it, something standing there, so close I could almost hear its breath. But I didn't look. Couldn't. "Don't look," I said aloud, trying to convince myself, trying to drown out the panic clawing at my mind. The girl's lips moved, forming the same words. I couldn't hear her, but I knew what she was saying. "Don't look at it." The flashlight flickered, and in the brief moments of darkness, I felt it again. The cold, wrong presence, its shadow creeping across the floor and swallowing the light. The tapping stopped. When the beam steadied again, the girl was gone. But her reflection lingered in the glass, staring at me with wide, empty eyes. Then the glass began to crack. It started small, a spiderweb fracture spreading from where her hand had been. But it grew fast, jagged lines snaking across the surface until the whole pane trembled under the pressure. And behind the cracks, something was moving. Not the girl. It was tall, angular, its smooth head tilted as it stepped closer, closer, closer. The glass shattered. The glass exploded inward with a deafening crash, shards scattering across the floor like jagged stars. I threw my arms up, shielding my face as the flashlight clattered from my grip. For a moment, there was only chaos. Sharp edges glinting in the dim light, the howling wind rushing into the station, and the icy sensation of dread wrapping around me like a noose. When the noise faded, the air went still again, thick with a suffocating silence. I crouched low behind an overturned shelf, my pulse hammering in my ears. My hands searched blindly for the flashlight, fingers brushing against broken glass and sticky patches of spilled soda. Then I heard it, the dragging sound. It was inside now. I froze, my body trembling as I strained to listen. The sound moved slowly across the tile, deliberate and heavy, like something taking its time. It was close, too close. And then, from somewhere to my left, a voice spoke. "Jim." It was the little girl's voice this time, soft and fragile, but it carried an edge of something far darker. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing myself tighter against the shelf. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "Why?" she asked. Her tone was innocent, almost playful. I didn't answer. The dragging sound stopped. "Jim," she said again, closer now. "You already looked. Don't you remember?" My breath hitched. Her words sent a chill through me, dredging up memories I couldn't quite place. Moments from earlier in the shift, flashes of the monitors, reflections in the glass. Had I looked? Had I seen it? Couldn't remember. "Stop it," I choked out, clutching a piece of broken glass like a weapon. My hand shook so badly I could barely hold it. The air around me grew colder, heavy with a pressure that made my ears pop. "You saw?" the voice said, shifting now. It wasn't the girl anymore. It wasn't even human. It was deep, guttural, layered with a sound like static. "You looked." My eyes snapped open, and I turned toward the sound without thinking. It was right there. The tall, faceless figure loomed over me, its smooth, blank head inches from mine. Its body was wrong, a patchwork of shapes that didn't fit together, limbs too long and too thin, joints that bent the wrong way. But its face, or lack of one, was the worst. Even without eyes, I could feel it staring at me. I screamed, lunging forward with the shard of glass in a desperate, wild swing. The sharp edge passed right through it like cutting through smoke. The figure didn't flinch, didn't react at all. Instead, it leaned closer, its head tilting as if studying me. "You looked?" it said again, the words vibrating through my skull. And then the lights came back on. The figure vanished. I was alone in the gas station, surrounded by shattered glass and overturned shelves. The air was still again, but the weight of its presence lingered, a suffocating reminder that it was never really gone. The door creaked behind me, the bell jingling softly. I turned slowly, my heart pounding. The parking lot outside was empty, but the little girl was there again, standing at the edge of the light. Her lips moved, forming the same silent words. "Don't look at it." I stared at the girl through the broken door, my legs refusing to move. Her lips kept forming the same words over and over. "Don't look at it." The meaning felt different now, like it wasn't a warning for me anymore. It was a warning about me. Behind her, the shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward her like claws. I tried to call out, to tell her to run, but my throat felt constricted, like something was gripping it from the inside. She tilted her head slightly, her wide eyes locking with mine. Then she did something I hadn't seen her do before. She smiled. It wasn't the smile of a little girl. It was slow, deliberate, and far too sharp. The expression didn't belong on her face. And then she whispered something new. "You're one of us now." My stomach dropped as the words settled in. The shadows around her surged forward, swallowing her completely. The parking lot went dark again, the lights overhead flickering weakly. I stumbled back into the station, gripping the counter for support. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened, what was happening. None of it made sense. The sound of footsteps, light and rhythmic, echoed from somewhere deeper in the station. I turned, my flashlight darting across the aisles. Empty. "Jim," a voice called. It was the cashier's voice this time. "Back here," it said. I didn't want to follow it, but my legs moved on their own, carrying me deeper into the station. My heart hammered against my ribs as I rounded the corner, stepping into the storage room at the back. It was empty, except for one thing, a mirror. It was tall and old, its edges framed with tarnished brass. The glass shimmered faintly, even in the dim light, and in the reflection I saw them. The tall figures, the girl, the thing with no face. They stood in the mirror, staring at me from the other side. And I was standing with them. I staggered back, shaking my head violently. "No," I muttered, my voice cracking. "No, this isn't real. This can't be real." The reflection didn't move. It stayed perfectly still even as I backed away, even as I raised the flashlight. Then the reflection of me smiled. It was the same smile the girl had given me, too sharp and far too wrong. The figures in the mirror leaned closer, their faceless heads tilting in unison. "You looked," my reflection said, its voice a perfect mimicry of my own. The lights in the gas station flickered one last time, and then everything went black. I woke up in my car, parked in the Walmart lot, as the first rays of dawn crept over the horizon. My head throbbed, and my clothes were damp with sweat. For a moment, I thought it was all a dream, but the parking lot was empty. The gas station was gone. Where the building had stood was now an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and littered with broken asphalt. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it wasn't real, but then I glanced in the car's rearview mirror. My reflection didn't move, smiled, and I finally understood the warning. Some things can't be unseen, and some things will never let you go.